For 6 ruthless years, Kong Miho has been Seoul's Ice King. A mafia boss so emotionally dead that his empire runs on cold calculation alone. No weakness. No desire. No heart. Just the suffocating weight of absolute control. That fortress shatters the instant Zola Monroe collapses into his arms. The exhausted waitress, pushed past her limit during a high-stakes dinner, meets his eyes for one breathless second before falling against his tailored suit, and something forbidden roars to life in the man who swore he'd never feel again. In front of a room full of killers and witnesses, Kong Miho does the unthinkable. Instead of letting security handle the inconvenience, he lifts her himself and refuses to let go. Now the most dangerous man in Korea is obsessed with the only woman who makes him feel alive, unaware that his instinct to protect her has just painted a target on both their backs. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The air inside the penthouse of the Miho estate was perpetually filtered, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, and smelled of nothing but expensive silence. Kong Miho stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass, his reflection a ghost superimposed over the neon veins of Seoul's midnight skyline. He was 32 at the peak of his power, and yet he felt like a specimen preserved in amber. Every morning his staff laid out a tailored suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Every afternoon he made decisions that moved millions of dollars and ended dozens of lives with a single nod. But beneath the crisp white collar of his shirt, Kong Miho was suffocating. His life was a series of high-walled rooms and bulletproof glass. To the world he was the Ice King. A man of such extreme emotional discipline that even his breathing seemed calculated. He moved through his existence with a quiet authority that commanded the very air to still, yet inside, there was a void so vast it had begun to swallow his sense of self. He was tired of the porcelain smiles of the women the syndicate sent to his bed, tired of the dry political maneuverings of the council, and tired of the mask he wore so tightly it had become his skin. He wanted something real, something that didn't bow before his name. But in his world reality was a luxury he couldn't afford. 5 miles away across the Han River, the air was thick with the scent of cheap grease, exhaust fumes, and the desperate energy of the city's underbelly. Zola Monroe adjusted the strap of her heavy bag, her shoulders throbbing with a dull, persistent ache that had become her constant companion. The humid night air made her long, wavy hair cling to her neck, but she didn't have the time to care. She was currently 20 minutes into the gap between her second and third job, fueling herself with a lukewarm coffee and the sheer stubborn will to survive. Zola's life was not a series of rooms, but a series of clocks. She lived by the seconds. 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. was the hospital laundry. 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. was the call center. And now the graveyard shift at the Obsidian, an ultra-exclusive private club where the city's elite came to play God. She moved through the crowded streets with a natural, striking elegance that she was too exhausted to realize she possessed. Her deep skin tone glowed under the flickering street lamps, a stark and beautiful contrast to the gray concrete of the industrial district. She wasn't working these hours for a dream, she was working them for a debt. Her father's medical bills had been a mountain that became an avalanche after his passing, and now her younger brother's tuition rested solely on her tired back. Every time she felt her knees buckle, she pictured his face at graduation, and the strength returned. She was a woman of fire and resilience, but even the strongest metal fatigues under constant pressure. Entering the service door of the Obsidian, Zola swapped her worn sneakers for black heels that pinched her toes. She donned the fitted black server's uniform, the fabric hugging her curves in a way that felt like armor. She checked herself in the cracked staff mirror, forced a confident, alluring smile onto her face, and stepped out into the dim, jazz-filled lounge. Tonight was different. The atmosphere in the club was taut, vibrating with a suppressed violence that Zola recognized from her years on the streets. The VVIP section had been cleared for a single party. As she balanced a tray of crystal glassware, she saw them, the men in dark suits, the heavy-set guards with scanning eyes, and at the center of the storm, a man who looked like he was carved from obsidian himself. Kong Miho sat at the head of the table, his posture composed and restrained, a dark prince in a room full of monsters. He looked up, his sharp features catching the light of the chandelier, And for a split second, his gaze drifted toward the service station. Zola felt a strange electric jolt in her chest, a sudden awareness that had nothing to do with her exhaustion. For Kong Miho, the girl in the shadows was the first thing in years that didn't look like part of the scenery. She was vibrant, a splash of color in his monochrome world. But as she stepped forward to serve the first course, the heat of the kitchen and the weight of 3 jobs finally converged. The edges of her vision began to fray into black lace. The glass ceiling of her endurance had finally shattered. The air in the private dining vault of the Obsidian was thick with the scent of aged whiskey and the heavy metallic tang of unspoken threats. Around the circular mahogany table sat the architects of Soul's Misery, the Syndicate Council, their faces etched with the arrogance of men who bought and sold lives before breakfast. At the center of this den of wolves, Kong Miho remained a statue of terrifying composure. He hadn't touched his steak. He simply watched the steam rise from it, his mind miles away from the boring logistics of the political marriage they were currently trying to force upon him. The merger with the Kim family is not a suggestion, Kong Miho, Chairman Park rasped, his eyes narrow and greedy. Your bloodline is the syndicate's stability. You need a wife who understands our laws, not a heart that beats for anything else. Kong Miho's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his silver fork. My heart beats for the efficiency of this organization, Chairman. Nothing more. It was a lie, of course. His heart felt like a lead weight, sinking further into the dark water of his own apathy. But then the heavy double doors swung open. Zola entered the room, and the atmosphere shifted. She didn't walk like the other servers, who moved with a fearful, hurried gait. Even under the crushing weight of her exhaustion, she moved with a rhythmic, innate grace that drew Kong Miho's eyes like a moth to a flame. He watched her approach, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she balanced the heavy tray of vintage red wine. Up close, he could see the fine beads of perspiration on her forehead, and the way her long dark lashes fluttered as if she were fighting to keep the world in focus. She reached the table, leaning forward to replace the chairman's glass. The scent of her, something warm like vanilla and honest sweat, pierced through the sterile, expensive perfumes of the room. Kong Miho found himself leaning in, his gaze fixed on her striking features. For the first time in years, the Ice King felt a flicker of genuine curiosity. Then it happened. As Zola pivoted to reach Kong Miho's side, the world seemed to tilt for her. The vibrant colors of the room washed out into a dull static gray. Her breath hitched, a soft, broken sound that only Kong Miho heard. The heavy tray tilted, the crystal glasses sliding toward the edge, but Zola didn't try to catch them. Her knees simply gave way. The room erupted into a symphony of shattering glass and startled shouts as red wine splattered like blood across the white linens. The guards instinctively reached for their holsters, reacting to the sudden chaos. Security! Get this mess out of... Chairman Park began, his face contorting in disgust. But Kong Miho was already moving. In a blur of motion that defied his usual calculated restraint, Kong Miho surged out of his chair. He didn't care about the wine ruining his $5,000 suit or the shards of crystal biting into the floor. He caught her before her head hit the mahogany, his strong arms wrapping around her slight, limp frame. The vault went deathly silent. 10 of the most dangerous men in Asia stared in stunned disbelief as their cold, untouchable leader knelt on the floor, cradling a waitress in his arms. Boss! His second-in-command, Jace, stepped forward, reaching out to take Zola. I'll have the boys throw her in the back of an ambulance. We need to resume the meeting. Kong Miho's head snapped up. The look in his eyes wasn't the usual icy detachment. It was a dark, protective fire that made Jace freeze in his tracks. It was the look of a predator claiming its prize. Do not touch her. Kong Miho's voice was a low, vibrating growl that carried more authority than any shout. He looked down at Zola. Her face was pale, her expression peaceful in its unconsciousness, her head resting against the hollow of his shoulder. She looked so fragile, yet in his arms, she felt like the only solid thing in a world of illusions. Chairman, Kong Miho said, his voice returning to a terrifyingly calm level as he stood up, lifting Zola effortlessly. She was as light as a feather, a broken bird he had no intention of letting go. The meeting is over. Kong Miho, be reasonable, Park spluttered, gesturing toward the security cameras in the corners of the room. The footage. The scandal of you tending to a servant. Delete the footage, Kong Miho interrupted, his gaze sweeping over the room with lethal intent. If a single frame of this woman leaves this room, I will burn the obsidian to the ground with every one of you inside it. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the vault, shielding Zola's face from the prying eyes of the staff and the paparazzi lingering near the entrance. He didn't head for the service exit. He walked straight toward his private elevator, his stride long and purposeful. His decision was made. He wasn't sending her to a hospital where she would become a nameless file. He was taking her to the only place he felt safe, his fortress. As the elevator doors hissed shut, Kong Miho looked down at the woman in his arms and felt his pulse thrumming against his ribs. The Ice King hadn't just saved a waitress. He had found his heartbeat, and he would kill anyone who tried to stop it from skipping again. The scent of expensive sandalwood and sterilized silk was the first thing to greet Zola as her consciousness flickered back to life. It was a cold, masculine fragrance, nothing like the humid, metallic air of the kitchen at the Obsidian. When she opened her eyes, she didn't see the water-stained ceiling of her cramped apartment. Instead, she was staring at a canopy of dark, brushed velvet. She sat up abruptly, a sharp spike of vertigo making her head spin. She was in a room that felt more like a cathedral of wealth than a bedroom. The walls were paneled in rare, dark wood, and the floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of Seoul that only the gods or the monsters of the city were allowed to see. She looked down and gasped. Someone had removed her wine-stained uniform and replaced it with a silk robe that felt like cool water against her skin. "You're awake." The voice was like low-frequency thunder, vibrating through the floorboards. Zola snapped her head toward the corner of the room. Kong Miho sat in a high-backed leather chair, his long legs crossed, a crystal glass of amber liquid held loosely in his hand. He had discarded his suit jacket and rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, revealing forearms that looked like they were corded with steel. His expression was a mask of terrifying, quiet authority. "Where am I?" Zola's voice was raspy, but her gaze didn't waver. Even in this gilded cage, the fire that had kept her alive through 3 jobs and a mountain of debt burned in her eyes. "My private estate," Kong Miho replied, his dark eyes tracking her every movement with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You collapsed. Most people in my world would have left you for the cleaners to handle. I chose otherwise." Zola felt a surge of indignation overshadowing her fear. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the way the plush carpet seemed to swallow her feet. "I appreciate the hospitality, Mr. Miho, or whatever they call you, but I have a life to get back to. I have a shift starting in 4 hours, and I can't afford to play Sleeping Beauty in a Mafia fortress." Kong Miho stood up, the sheer scale of his presence suddenly making the cavernous room feel small. He walked toward her, his movements slow and predatory. "You were malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from acute physical exhaustion. If I let you go, you'll be dead within a week. Is that the life you're so eager to return to?" He stopped just inches from her. The height difference was staggering, but Zola didn't shrink back. Instead, she tilted her head back, her intimate gaze meeting his icy stare with a boldness that clearly caught him off guard. "My life is my own," she challenged, her voice dropping to a low, defiant silk. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't get to decide when I'm done. I don't need a savior, and I certainly don't need a jailer in a tailored suit." A flicker of something, amusement or perhaps a dangerous kind of respect, crossed Kong Miho's sharp features. For 3 years, he had been surrounded by people who trembled when he breathed. Yet this woman, who had nothing but the robe on her back, was standing in his inner sanctum and talking to him as if he were a common trespasser. "You have a sharp tongue for someone whose body gave out on them 2 hours ago," Kong Miho murmured, reaching out. His fingers didn't touch her, but he traced the air near her jawline, the heat from his hand radiating against her deep skin tone. "The council is already asking questions about why I carried a waitress out of a VVIP meeting. You are no longer just a server, Zola Monroe. You are a complication." "Then simplify it," Zola countered. leaning forward slightly, her posture radiating an emotional dominance that clashed violently with his cold control. Open the door and let me walk out. Unless, of course, the great Kong Miho is afraid of what happens when he can't control everything in his sight. Kong Miho's eyes darkened, the hidden intensity he usually kept under lock and key beginning to leak through the cracks. He wasn't used to temptation, and he certainly wasn't used to seduction that felt like a challenge. The chemistry between them was a physical weight in the room, a forbidden tension that threatened to shatter his carefully maintained discipline. The doors stay locked until I say otherwise, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive whisper. You wanted a reason to breathe, Zola? You found it. But in this house, there is only one authority. Zola's lips curled into a small, defiant smile. We'll see about that. She turned her back on the most dangerous man in Seoul and walked toward the window, looking out at the city she had to conquer. Kong Miho watched her, his heart thrumming a rhythm he didn't recognize. The cage was gilded and the prisoner was bold, but as he watched the moonlight catch the waves of her hair, he realized he was the one who was truly trapped. The sun rose over the Miho estate not with a gentle warmth, but with a sharp clinical glare that reflected off the polished steel and glass of the study. Kong Miho sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of black marble, his eyes fixed on a thin digital file. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a ledger of drug shipments or territory disputes. He was looking at the life of Zola Monroe, laid bare in cold, hard numbers. His second-in-command, Jace, stood at a respectful distance, his voice low. She's been working 80-hour weeks for the last 2 years, boss. Most of it goes to the Starlight Medical Group, but there's a secondary drain. A high-interest loan from the Guansu family. It's a predatory contract. Even with 3 jobs, she's barely covering the interest. Kong Miho's jaw tightened. The Guansu family were scavengers, a rival syndicate that specialized in picking the bones of the city's working class. The thought of their grimy hands reaching into Zola's life, threatening the woman who currently occupied his guest wing, caused a stir of hidden intensity that vibrated in his chest like a low-frequency hum. Pay it, Kong Miho commanded, his voice a quiet rasp. All of it. Principal, interest, and a tax for the trouble they've caused her. Tell Guansu that if he so much as sends a text message to her number again, I will personally dismantle his operation. And the girl, boss? Do we tell her? No, Kong Miho said, his gaze drifting to the security monitor showing Zola pacing the balcony of her room. I want to see how she handles the weight being lifted. An hour later, Kong Miho entered the dining hall to find Zola standing by the window. She had refused to sit, her posture one of boldness and desire even in her exhaustion. She held her phone in a trembling hand, her eyes wide as she stared at the screen. My debt, she whispered, not looking at him as he approached. It's gone. The portal says account closed. Paid in full. Was this you? Kong Miho stopped a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, projecting his usual quiet authority. It was a logical move, Zola. You cannot focus on your recovery while being harassed by low-level thugs. Consider it a gift for the inconvenience of your stay. Zola turned to him then, and the look in her eyes wasn't the gratitude he had expected. It wasn't the relief he had seen on the faces of people he had bought or intimidated. It was a fierce, blazing pride. A gift? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. She walked toward him, her intimate gaze locking onto his with a power that made the air in the room feel heavy. You think you can just swipe a card and own my struggle? That debt was my burden to carry. It was the proof that I could take care of my own. It was a death sentence, Kong Miho countered, his own voice dropping into a dark, protective register. They would have eventually taken more than money from you, Zola. I've seen how they operate. And what makes you any different? She challenged, stopping so close that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She reached out, her fingers brushing the lapel of his expensive suit, a gesture of emotional dominance that defied the hierarchy of the room. You didn't do this for me. You did this to put your mark on me. To turn a debt I owed a shark into a debt I owe a king. Well, I have news for you, Mr. Miho. I am not for sale. Kong Miho felt a jolt of electricity at her touch, A forbidden connection that threatened to break his legendary restraint. He had spent his life buying loyalty and selling fear, but here was a woman who looked at his billions and saw nothing but chains. "I don't want your money and I don't want your charity," Zola continued, her voice a soft, defiant silk. "I'll stay here until I'm well enough to walk, because I'm a realist. But every cent you paid to that shark I will pay back to you. With interest. I will not be another trophy in your collection." She pulled her hand away, leaving a cold spot on his chest where her heat had been. Kong Miho watched her walk back toward the window, her silhouette framed by the morning light. His pulse was thrumming, a violent, immediate rhythm that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't feel insulted. He felt captivated. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a complication to be managed. He was looking at a woman who was his equal in spirit. His interest wasn't just piqued. It was becoming an obsession. "Very well, Zola," Kong Miho murmured, his voice thick with a new kind of hunger. "Pay me back if you must. But realize that in this house, the currency isn't always money." Zola didn't turn around, but he saw the slight tension in her shoulders. The game had changed. The Ice King had tried to buy her freedom, only to realize that her spirit was the only thing he truly wanted to capture. And that was a debt no amount of gold could ever settle. The following evening, the oppressive heat of the city was replaced by a cool, fragrant breeze that swept through the estate's private botanical garden. This was Kong Miho's sanctuary, a glass-enclosed world of rare orchids and weeping willows where the chaos of the syndicate couldn't reach him. He stood by a koi pond, the dark water reflecting the moon, but his mind wasn't on the tranquility of the space. It was on the woman who had spent the last 3 days challenging every foundation of his life. He heard the soft click of her heels on the stone path before he saw her. Zola appeared from between two towering ferns, wearing a simple silk dress he had provided. The deep emerald green of the fabric made her skin glow like polished mahogany. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. She looked like a queen surveying a conquered territory. Her long wavy hair moved with her stride, and as she reached the edge of the pond, she didn't wait for him to speak. "This place is beautiful," she said, her voice a soft silk that harmonized with the bubbling water. "It's hard to believe a man who makes his living in the shadows would build something so full of life." Kong Miho turned to face her, his posture as composed and restrained as ever, but the hidden intensity in his eyes was becoming harder to mask. "Beauty is easier to control than people, Zola. Flowers don't talk back. They don't have pride that makes them refuse help." Zola stepped closer, ignoring the invisible boundary he usually maintained. She stopped so near that he could see the amber flecks in her eyes. "Is that what you think? That pride is a flaw? In my world, pride is the only thing they can't take from you when you have nothing else. You see it as a barrier. I see it as a shield." She reached out, not to touch his suit this time, but to brush a stray petal from his shoulder. Her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second, and Kong Miho felt the forbidden connection spark again, a violent, silent vibration that traveled straight to his core. He looked down at her, his sharp features softening for the first time in years. "You're the first person to step into this garden and tell me I'm wrong," Kong Miho murmured, his voice dropping into a dark, intimate register. "Maybe that's because the people you surround yourself with are too afraid of the Ice King to see the man underneath," Zola countered. She leaned forward, her intimate gaze locking onto his with a boldness that felt like a physical weight. "I've seen how you look at the city when you think no one is watching. You aren't looking at your empire, Kong Miho. You're looking for a way out." The silence that followed was heavy with tension, the clash of his restraint against her seduction. For a decade, Kong Miho had built his emotional walls stone by stone, reinforced by the blood and betrayal of his position. But as Zola stood there, her presence radiating a warmth and emotional dominance he couldn't calculate away, he felt a crack form. "You see too much," he whispered. "I see a man who is lonely in a room full of people," she replied. She reached up, her palm coming to rest against his cheek. Her skin was warm, a vibrant contrast to the coldness he had cultivated for so long. Kong Miho didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief, vulnerable moment. The first breach had occurred. The man who ruled Seoul with an iron fist and a frozen heart felt the ice begin to thaw. It wasn't just a physical attraction. It was a soul-deep recognition. In the quiet of the garden, surrounded by the scent of night-blooming jasmine, Kang Mi-ho realized that his greatest enemy wasn't the council or the rival families. It was the terrifying possibility that he might actually want to be saved. When he opened his eyes, the restraint was gone, replaced by a raw, hungry intensity. He looked at Zola, and for the first time in his life he didn't see a complication or a debt. He saw his future. "If you keep looking at me like that," Kang Mi-ho said, his voice thick with a newfound desire, "I may never let you leave this garden." Zola's lips curved into that same defiant, beautiful smile. "Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of the dark." The sanctuary of the garden was a distant memory the following morning, replaced by the suffocating, windowless confines of the High Council's inner chamber. The air here was heavy with the smell of old tobacco, and the weight of centuries-old traditions that felt like a noose around Kang Mi-ho's neck. 12 elders sat in a semicircle of shadows, their faces obscured by the dim lighting, leaving only their cold, judgmental eyes visible. Kang Mi-ho stood at the center of the room, his posture a masterpiece of quiet authority and emotional discipline. He had fastened every button of his dark suit, sealing himself back into the armor of the Ice King. But beneath the surface, the forbidden connection he had forged with Zola in the moonlight was screaming for release. "You have been distracted, Kang Mi-ho," Chairman Park's voice rasped, cutting through the silence like a dull blade. "The reports are consistent. You brought an outsider, a servant, into your home. You shielded her from the syndicate's gaze. You even paid her debts to the Guansu family." "I am securing a witness," Kang Mi-ho replied, his voice a calm, lethal monotone. "She saw faces at the dinner that shouldn't have been there. I am keeping her close until the threat is neutralized." "Do not lie to us," a voice from the shadows hissed. "We have seen the way you look at her. We have heard of the change in your temperament. A man who rules Seoul cannot afford a heartbeat that isn't his own. You are a king, Kang Mi-ho, and a king must have a queen of our choosing, not a waitress who fell into his lap by chance." The chairman stood up, leaning his withered hands on the table. "The Kim family is losing patience. The merger is the only way to prevent a war with the Northern Territories. This girl is a stain on your reputation, a weakness that our enemies are already preparing to exploit." Kang Mi-ho's jaw tightened, a pulse leaping in his temple. "She is under my protection." "Then her protection is your downfall," Park countered. "The council has reached a decision. You have 48 hours to dispose of the girl. We don't care how it is done. A flight back to her country with a silenced tongue, or a shallow grave in the woods. If she is still within your reach by dawn on the third day, you will be stripped of your title. Your assets will be frozen, your name will be erased, and the syndicate will handle the Zola Monroe problem with their own methods." The threat was absolute. If he lost his title, he lost the very power he needed to keep Zola safe. Without his army, without his immunity, they would both be hunted down like animals. The stakes had reached a boiling point. It was no longer just about his heart, but about their survival. "You are asking me to choose between my life's work and a woman," Kang Mi-ho said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl that made the younger guards at the door shift uncomfortably. "We are asking you to remember who you are," Park said. "You aren't Mi-ho. You are the shadow that keeps this city in order. Do not let a moment of seduction destroy a legacy of blood." Kang Mi-ho didn't respond. He turned on his heel and walked out of the chamber, his stride long and purposeful. The restraint was still there, but inside the hidden intensity was transforming into something more dangerous. A plan. He knew the council expected him to bow to tradition. They expected the Ice King to freeze his feelings once more and do what was logical. But as he stepped into the sunlight and thought of Zola's defiant smile, and the warmth of her hand against his cheek, Kang Mi-ho realized the elders had made a fatal mistake. They thought his love for her was his weakness. They didn't realize that for the first time in his life it was his reason to fight. The ultimatum had been delivered, but the war had only just begun. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a cathedral of gold leaf, shimmering crystal and predatory ambition. This was the annual Foundation Gala. The one night of the year when the underworld wore its finest silk to rub shoulders with the city's legitimate power brokers. Every guest in the room was aware of the council's ultimatum. They whispered behind champagne flutes, betting on which suitable bride Kong Miho would finally present to save his throne. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the whispers died a sudden violent death. Kong Miho stepped into the light, his quiet authority radiating like a physical force. But he wasn't alone. On his arm was Zola Monroe, and she was a vision that made the room's expensive decor look cheap. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue velvet that draped over her curves like liquid night. Her deep skin tone was accentuated by a necklace of raw diamonds Kong Miho had placed around her neck himself. Her long wavy hair swept back to reveal an expression of allure and emotional dominance. She didn't look like a waitress rescued from a kitchen. She looked like the reason empires fell. Kong Miho led her down the grand staircase, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. His touch was a declaration of war. By bringing her here, he wasn't just breaking a rule. He was incinerating the rulebook. "Keep your head high, Zola," Kong Miho murmured, his voice a low, protective vibration that only she could hear. "Tonight, you are the only queen in this room." "I'm not afraid of them, Kong Miho," she replied, her intimate gaze meeting his with a boldness that sent a jolt of electricity through his veins. "I'm only worried about you. You're burning your world down for me." "It was a cold world anyway," he countered, his sharp features softening for a fleeting second. The council members stood in a tight cluster near the stage, their faces turning a mottled purple. Chairman Park stepped forward, his eyes darting toward the photographers. "Kong Miho, have you lost your mind? This is a public event. To flaunt this girl here is an insult to every family present." "She is my guest, Chairman," Kong Miho said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register. "And as of tonight, she is my priority. If the Kim family or the council finds that insulting, they are welcome to challenge me here and now." The tension in the ballroom was a physical weight, a restraint clashing with seduction, that made the air feel thin. Kong Miho ignored the gasps and the glares, leading Zola toward the center of the dance floor. As the orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz, he pulled her into his arms. The chemistry between them reached a breaking point. For the first time in his life, Kong Miho wasn't dancing to show power or to follow protocol. He was holding the woman who had breached his walls, her heat seeping through his tailored suit and into his very soul. Zola leaned in, her forward posture suggesting a desire that defied the hundreds of eyes watching them. "You're shaking," she whispered, her hand sliding up to the nape of his neck. "I've spent 10 years being a statue," Kong Miho admitted, his eyes dark with hidden intensity. "Being near you, it's like coming back to life all at once. It's violent. It's undeniable." Zola's eyes searched his, finding the man underneath the Ice King. "Then stop fighting it. Let them see you bleed. Let them see you love." In the middle of the crowded ballroom surrounded by enemies and cameras, Kong Miho did the unthinkable. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was a deep, possessive claim that shattered his reputation for emotional discipline forever. The room erupted, not in applause but in a chaotic surge of movement. Security moved in, cameras flashed like lightning, and the chairman's scream of "treason" echoed against the gold leaf ceiling. Kong Miho pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against Zola's. "The mask is off," he whispered, his pulse thrumming against hers. "Good," Zola replied, her eyes blazing with a fierce, forbidden light. "Now we show them how a king and queen really fight." The gala was no longer a party. It was a battlefield. And as the council's men began to close in, Kong Miho knew the price of this dance would be paid in blood. The aftermath of the gala was not a slow fade, but a violent fracture. One moment Kong Miho was shielding Zola from the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi. The next, the world dissolved into screeching tires and the acrid smell of burnt rubber. A black SUV had jumped the curb, and in the coordinated chaos of a smoke grenade, the warmth that had anchored Kong Miho's soul was ripped from his side. Now, Kong Miho stood in the center of his private armory, the silence of the room heavier than any scream. He looked at his reflection in the polished steel of a weapons locker. He was still wearing the tuxedo from the gala, the tailored suit of a gentleman, the uniform of a man who played by the syndicate's rules. But the man in the mirror was gone. The quiet authority had been replaced by a hollow, terrifying darkness. His phone vibrated on the marble bench. No caller ID. She's at the old shipyard, Kong Miho. Chairman Park's voice was thin, devoid of its usual feigned warmth. The Kim family is there to witness your abdication. You come alone. You sign over the territories. You marry the Kim daughter tonight. Or the girl goes into the harbor in a concrete jacket. Choose your legacy, boy. Kong Miho didn't respond. He crushed the phone in his hand until the glass bit into his palm, drawing a thin line of blood. For a decade, he had protected his legacy. He had lived for the Miho name, for the cold logic of the syndicate. But as he looked at the blood on his hand, he realized that a legacy of ice was nothing compared to the fire Zola had ignited in him. He reached for his tuxedo jacket and tore it off, the fine silk ripping with a jagged sound. He discarded the tie, the cufflinks, and the heavy gold watch, the trappings of the Ice King. He reached into the back of the locker and pulled out a tactical vest and a pair of serrated blades. He wasn't going as a businessman. He was going as a monster. "Boss," Jace whispered from the doorway, his eyes wide as he saw Kong Miho's transformation. "If you go there like this, there is no coming back. You'll be a war criminal in the eyes of the council. You'll lose everything." "I've already lost everything if she isn't breathing," Kong Miho said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that sounded nothing like the man who had sat at the head of the council table. "They wanted me to choose between my crown and my heart. Tell them I've chosen." He stepped out into the night, the rain beginning to fall in a cold, relentless sheet. He drove toward the shipyard not with his usual calculated speed, but with a hidden intensity that bordered on suicidal. When he arrived, the cranes of the shipyard looked like skeletal giants against the gray sky. He saw her. Zola was tied to a chair on the edge of a rusted pier, her emerald dress torn, her striking facial features bruised but her eyes still blazing with that same boldness and desire. Behind her stood 20 armed men and the elders of the council, looking like vultures in their overcoats. "Sign the papers, Kong Miho," Park shouted over the wind. "Return to the fold and we can forget this madness." Kong Miho stepped out of his car. He wasn't the well-groomed, sharp-featured man they knew. His hair was disheveled, his shirt was stained with his own blood, and his expression was one of such raw, predatory violence that even the seasoned guard stepped back. He looked at Zola, and for a heartbeat the monster softened. "Close your eyes, Zola," Kong Miho called out, his voice cutting through the gale. "Kong Miho, no!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Don't do this for me. Don't let them take who you are." "They aren't taking who I am, Zola," Kong Miho muttered to himself as he drew the first blade, the steel catching the moonlight. "They're meeting the man you finally woke up." The restraint snapped. Kong Miho didn't walk toward the pier. He surged. He moved with a violent, immediate speed that rendered the guards' firearms useless in the close-quarters darkness. He was no longer a king. He was a force of nature, a man who had traded his tailored suits for a blood-stained path of devotion. The price of love was high, and Kong Miho was ready to pay every cent in blood to get his heartbeat back. The shipyard was a symphony of rain and steel, but the only sound Kong Miho heard was the rhythmic beat of his own heart, a sound he had only truly learned to recognize since meeting Zola. He moved through the shadows of the pier like a phantom of vengeance, his blades finding the gaps in the guard's armor with a precision that was no longer calculated, but instinctive. The Ice King had melted away, leaving behind a man forged in the fire of absolute devotion. One by one, the council's men fell, unable to stand against the raw, hidden intensity of a leader who had finally found something worth more than power. Kong Miho reached the edge of the pier, his shirt soaked with rain and the blood of those who had dared to touch what was his. Chairman Park stood trembling over Zola, a small pistol held in a shaking hand, but Kong Miho didn't stop. He walked through the rain, his eyes fixed on Zola's striking facial features, promising her a world where she would never have to be afraid again. "It's over, Park." Kong Miho's voice was a low, vibrating growl that silenced the wind. "You thought my love for her was a weakness. You didn't realize it was the only thing making me human enough to show mercy. And tonight I have none left." Before the chairman could pull the trigger, Kong Miho's blade found its mark. The pistol clattered to the rusted metal floor, followed shortly by the man who had tried to dictate the terms of Kong Miho's life. Kong Miho didn't look back at the fallen elder. He dropped to his knees beside Zola, his hands, the same hands that had signed death warrants and moved millions, trembling as he sliced through her restraints. "I've got you," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. Zola leaned into him, her intimate gaze searching his face even in the darkness. She didn't see the monster the council feared. She saw the man who had finally learned to burn. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice a soft, defiant silk. "I knew you wouldn't let the ice win." In the weeks that followed, the purge was absolute. Kong Miho didn't just remove the council. He dismantled the very foundation of the old world. He replaced the archaic, blood-soaked traditions with a new order, one built on the quiet authority he had always possessed, but tempered by the resilience and boldness he had learned from Zola. The new reign of the Miho Syndicate began not with a coronation, but with a transformation. Kong Miho no longer sat in a windowless vault or hid behind a mask of emotional discipline. He ruled from the light. The penthouse was no longer a specimen jar. It was a home. Zola stood beside him, not as a protected secret, but as his equal, the woman who had dared to challenge the most dangerous man in Seoul and won his soul in the process. They stood together on the balcony of the estate, looking out over a city that was finally beginning to breathe. Kong Miho wore a tailored suit, as sharp and elegant as ever, but his posture was no longer restrained. He held Zola's hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, the forbidden connection, now a permanent bond that the world had no choice but to respect. "They still whisper, you know," Zola murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "They say the king of Seoul traded his crown for a waitress." Kong Miho turned to her, his sharp features breaking into a genuine radiant smile, a sight that would have terrified his former enemies. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "Let them whisper. They don't understand that I didn't trade anything. I finally found the only thing that makes the crown worth wearing." The restrained man had finally embraced his intensity, and as he looked into Zola's eyes, he knew that the ice would never return. He had been a walking corpse for 10 years, but in the arms of the woman who had collapsed at his feet, Kong Miho had finally learned what it meant to rule, not with fear, but with a heart that was finally violently alive. The end. If this story made you feel something, like the video and subscribe for more.